Hey everybody, this is Brian. Hope you're having a great day. And just wanted to give you a heads up. There is an error in this week's show, and I wanted to just go ahead and correct it up front rather than doing a whole bunch of re-recording and edits and all other sort of things that would delay the show. Anyways, towards the end of the show, probably about the fifth or sixth topic or so in, I sort of flip-flopped and confused two standards organizations. So towards the end, we're talking about some new open projects that are going on around containers, and I sort of superimposed talking about the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and Kubernetes and Prometheus, when I should have been talking about the OCI, the Open Container Initiative. So it should be obvious towards the end. The mistake is that the project that's in question, that's called OCID or CRIO, it should be something that is sort of targeted towards maybe eventually, potentially, who knows when, becoming part of OCI, and it would not be in the CNCF's domain. So anyways, apologize for the confusion. Just wanted to kind of clear that up, that I kind of superimposed or mixed up two governance foundations. So hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Again, as always, if you have any questions or feedback, please let us know. Thank you.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast, coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. You know, today we're going to do something that's a little bit different, just in terms of the format. And the reason being, it's just going to be me today. Aaron is out, partially dealing with this hurricane that's coming through and some other stuff. We've both been traveling a ton. And, Aaron had asked me a question. He'd sent me a DM the other day, and we had intended to do this as a two-man show, but he had some stuff come up. But I thought, we missed last week's show. We always feel a little bit bad and guilty about missing a show week in and week out. So I wanted to make sure that we got a show out this week. And he'd asked me a really good question, and one that's been going on a lot in the industry. So I thought I would try and address it myself. Hopefully you guys are okay with this format of me just sort of taking questions or taking apart the question that he asked me and then trying to give some perspective on things. So anyways, the question Aaron basically asked me was, he said, hey, man, there's a bunch of discussion going on about container standards, what's going on around container standards. There's talk of forking standards and so on and so forth. Can you make sense to me? And you sort of work on this stuff. So first off, sort of full disclosure, and I had thought this was pretty well out in the industry, but some people brought it up to me the other day. Full disclosure, I work for Red Hat. My day job is focused on the strategy of Red Hat's container strategy and their container platform called OpenShift. So just wanted to get that out in the open. What we're going to talk about in this podcast is really going to be, I'm going to try and keep it as abstracted away from my day-to-day job, and hence any bias that would typically come from a person associated with a vendor. But I will let you know that some of the discussion that's going on in the industry, involves Red Hat. And so I'll try and be very clear where there is involvement of Red Hat versus just kind of trying to explain what's going on out there. And if anybody, thinks that this comes across as too biased, feel free to give us some feedback on it. But again, the intention of this is really to sort of answer Aaron's original question, which was, hey, what's going on with all these things that are being discussed around, are there new container standards coming up? Is something going on with a fork? And what does all this stuff mean? Okay. So let me start with the most basic things. And I'm going to sort of break down his question into a bunch of subsections that hopefully will try and explain things for people. So the first part of that is to sort of ask the question, are there container standards today? And what are the things that I should know with regard to container standards? So the way to think about this is to answer the question, containers, Linux containers in particular, have been around for a while. And I don't really want to get into a long history lesson, but, what are called C groups and the associated namespaces and the technology to create a standard or a container within Linux has been around since about 2006. It's been in the kernel for almost a decade now. And people like Google have talked about how, they run all of the processes and applications they do in containers and have done that for a long time. So container technology, C groups, namespaces, and so forth has been around in the Linux kernel for about 10 years. Obviously, if you look at some of the platform as a service vendors going all the way back to, Heroku, what OpenShift was doing back in 2011, what Cloud Foundry was doing back in 2011, so going back 5 years, and so forth, all of those platforms, if you provided an application to that platform, you provided code to that platform, when they would go execute that application, execute that code, that was almost in every one of those platforms running in containers. In some cases, they were called dynamos or cartridges or gears or, created by build packs, whatever the terminology was for the platform, they were running inside of containers, inside the platform, right? And even, the .cloud, the precursor company to Docker, .cloud, their platform as a service, use container technology. So containers have been around for about 10 years in terms of Linux. They've been in platforms for about 5 years in terms of, commercially available services and software. But the hype around containers really sort of took off, obviously, when .cloud ceased to exist. They became formerly Docker Incorporated, Docker Inc., or I'll call them Big D Docker. And Solomon, did his famous demonstration of sort of Docker run at Python, PyCon, I think it was, one of the Python events, back 4 or 5 years ago. So it's been around for a while. And, Docker Big D Docker did some fantastic work in terms of basically taking what was sort of a complicated technology to get running and made it incredibly simple. And hence, when we talk about containers, Docker, the word Docker tends to be sort of thrown around as if it's sort of like Kleenex or, Googling something for a search, right? It's sort of become very synonymous with Linux container technology. But to answer the original point, is there a standard for containers? Yes, there are elements that are standard in every Linux distribution, C groups and namespaces and other things. Docker, little d Docker, the project in open source, has really sort of, in a lot of cases, become kind of a de facto standard. And, a couple of years ago when the Rocket technology came out of CoreOS and there was kind of a divide somewhat in the container community, there was this thing called the Open Container Initiative, OCI, that got created that was essentially, kind of serving as a standards body or a foundation for, trying to create some sort of standardized container technology. And what came out of that was the Rocket technology from CoreOS, the concepts there, Docker, Big D Docker, contributed their technology, or at least part of their technology, to the OCI, and it created a couple of things. One was called the Run C, and one was called App C. And in essence, these were elements of being able to build both a container format and a container runtime that would allow more of a standardization than having it mostly be driven by a certain specific open source project, whether that project was Docker or Rocket or something else. So that's kind of the foundation of where this conversation is going to go. So we have sort of some de facto standards, if you will, or leading implementations. We have a foundation in OCI that's there to try and drive some standardization, more kind of formal standardization. And then we've got this technology that's been around for 10 years or 5 years or whatever you want to think about it. Now, the second thing that came up, and this has been thrown around quite a bit in the press and media, and I've heard it on podcasts and other things, is people said, okay, well, over the last couple of months, we've heard talk that there is going to be a fork of Docker. Companies or individuals are going to fork Docker for various reasons. So let's talk about a couple of these pieces and where the talk has come from. So the first thing to understand is when people say that something is being forked in open source, for those of you that don't live in the open source world or haven't been around open source for a long time, what a fork means, and there's some nuance to this, so I'm going to try and be as clear as I can. With open source projects, these are community driven, and Oftentimes they start with somebody who created the technology. That person, group, whatever it might be, a lot of times drives the vision of where the project goes. But as the community expands, sort of the leadership and the direction, the architecture of it, may evolve from being sort of one person or one group to being, multiple people. And anytime you have people and technology, you're going to, occasionally have differing opinions. And depending on how different those opinions might be, whether those opinions are being driven by, architectural decisions, technology decisions, or, in some cases they're being driven by, business and profit motives and so forth. The thing with open source is that all the software, depending on the licensing, but assuming it's using a licensing model that allows the software to be, reused, openly reused, there is a chance that some faction of a project, of a community, will get so frustrated with what's going on that they will create what's called a fork. And in essence, what that means is they want to take the project in a completely different direction. They just no longer feel like the original community can be there to have an open discussion and make the changes that are going to be inclusive of all of the ideas. And they are going to want to sort of break free and create kind of an independent project. And, that independent project would then have to be staffed, would have to be maintained, would have to be contributed to. And in a lot of cases, you have sort of a faction, right? And people like to use the analogy of things like Blu-ray versus, HD DVD or DVD, kind of comparisons and so forth, or Betamax versus VHS, kind of this split in the standard. It's one thing to have two competing standards. It's a different technically nuanced thing to have a fork. A fork means not just, we copied the code and made a few changes. It is, we want to create a completely different community. So let's put that in context. There were some articles that came out from the new stack, and let me step back by saying I think Alex, we've been always very we've always admired what Alex is doing, what his group and his organization does at the new stack. We think they do a great job. So there are no criticisms of what they've done, but they put out an article that said, hey, a fork of Docker is on the table, and there's some, pointing to those to that article in the show notes if you want to go take a look at it. And what the article sort of implied was that there may be a growing faction of companies or individuals who feel like the Docker community isn't being inclusive enough of the contributions from other companies or other individuals who may have ideas or an agenda or technology suggestions that may be contradictory to what Docker, Big D Docker, the commercial entity, are trying to drive with their business, right? And this is where open source sometimes can be a little bit confusing, especially if the project name and the name of the largest contributing company are the same, right? So that's why you keep hearing me say little d Docker, which is the open source project, and big D Docker, which is the incorporated business, run by Ben Golub and Solomon and so forth. So this rumor was sort of floated around, and one of the things that I think was somewhat misinterpreted was this idea that certain companies have already forked Docker. And I'll use Red Hat as an example, and I'm not going to explain Red Hat in a defensive way, but I'm just going to explain it the way that the Docker or the Red Hat team explained it. And then there's a blog post about this. It's in the show notes as well. So let's just use sort of Linux and Linux distributions and Red Hat as an example. So almost every Linux distribution these days, whether it's RHEL or Ubuntu or Rancher or CoreOS or anything else, they all support the ability to run Docker, run the Docker daemon and the other technology necessary for that, whether it's systemd or something else. And so all of them run this, and so you say, okay, well, it's just available technology at that point. And in the case of RHEL, and I'm only using RHEL as an example, other Linux distributions are the same way, there are going to be suggestions or patches or pull requests that are going to get made. Sometimes they might have been created by that vendor. So in this case, let's say Red Hat, or they may have been created or requested by a customer of that vendor. So let's say a Red Hat customer. And, not all of those patches or pull requests are going to get accepted by the, given open source project. So in this case, Docker. So what Red Hat does is they do something that's called carrying patches. And this is well laid out in the blog, so it's worth taking a read just for educational purposes. But in essence, what they're saying is, look, we have a bunch of things that we would like to see changed or fixed in the Docker project. And they're driven by, in the case of Red Hat, customer demand or just architectural considerations. And those things have not been accepted into the mainline Docker project. And so any company that distributes a Linux distribution, in this case, we'll call it RHEL, has an option. They can say, okay, I'm going to ignore those, and I'm just going to only provide what's in the, the Docker open source project. Or they have an option to say, well, we feel like that bug patch, enhancement would make the commercial product that we offer better. And we're going to carry those. And what that means is individually, the company that supports that Linux distribution is going to, on an ongoing basis, have to maintain those and support them and test them and document them and, all the types of things that you typically do in any commercial piece of software. And I think to a certain extent, this has been, misrepresented or represented in the industry as somewhat of a fork. And, if you go read the blog, the folks from Red Hat basically say, hey, we don't believe this is what would be considered a fork. Our intentions are not to create a separate project. We're simply, carrying elements that are going to enhance what's there in D. And people can have their own interpretations of that. I'm just kind of trying to explain the beginning of what was this set of conversations and rumors and so forth in terms of, is Red Hat or somebody else trying to fork Docker? And if you look at, what's in their distribution versus what's in the upstream bits, is that a fork, or is that just, a differentiation of patches and pull requests and things that haven't yet been incorporated? And I only highlight this because if you go to basically anybody who works with the Docker project, whether you're in networking or whether you're in security or whatever, there are going to be open issues that you push towards the community. And the community is going to make a decision, the community maintainers are going to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to accept those or not. And in some cases, the acceptance criteria might be, hey, you're just looking at this problem wrong. It's already solved, which is perfectly valid. In some cases, they're going to say, I just don't have time to get to that, right? Or it's not well documented or whatever. And so there are going to be valid reasons why those get rejected or they just get ignored. And then there are going to be other reasons why, they may not be accepted. And this is, sort of where you get into the gray areas of what's a commercial offering versus what is a community offering. And people can interpret that, in various ways. But anyways, I wanted to kind of talk about that in terms of like, what does a fork mean to begin with? There's at least generally accepted, there's a very different standard for something being a fork and becoming its own project, its own community, and essentially carrying patches for a commercial piece of software that is based on open source. And there's a little difference there between, there's a lot of difference there between that and something that would be called like open core, but we're not going to get into that today. So the next piece of that is really, let's get into reality. Why are all these discussions happening today? Like, why did this sort of come along? And it's a couple of different things. But I'll sort of point out, I think the biggest reason that this is happening now is, if we look at as an industry, the biggest talking point that every business is talking about, every vendor is talking about, most customers are talking about, is this idea of sort of digital transformation, which of course is kind of a buzzword, but it boils down to, more and more companies are realizing that their interface to customers is going to be centered around technology. Software is driving that technology experience, whether that is better understanding your markets, better interacting with your customers, better understanding the data of your interactions with those segments. And obviously software plays a big role in that. And, for those of us that have been paying attention to this quite a bit, the ability to move quickly and agile, in an agile fashion around this space, is sort of dictating who's winning and losing in certain industries. And so, container technology is sort of, in a lot of cases, at the core of how these these applications are being built or how they're being operated. We're seeing a massive amount of innovation happening, not only in container technology, but in things like container orchestrators, things like Kubernetes and Mesos and Cloud Foundry and Nomad and lots of other technologies that are out there. So the reason this is going on is anytime we have massive amounts of innovation and lots of different projects spinning up, people are trying to figure out, which one is the best, which one might win, where the community is going to kind of evolve to. And so it's only natural that we see, people, kind of intermixing technology discussions and business discussions, especially around the technology side, because ultimately this technology, these core technologies are, again, driving or are part of driving what's really top of mind for a lot of businesses, which is how do I become more modern? How do I become more digital? How do I become more of a software company, and so on and so forth. So the second part of that sort of follow-up is, where do these container orchestrators fit in? And, should anybody care, right? Should I care about, what's going on in the Docker container standard space if I'm more focused on container orchestration? And I think the answer to that question is they do sort of go hand in hand, right? So just to step back a little bit, if you look at any of the container orchestrators that are out there today, or most of them, so take something like Kubernetes or Mesos, I'll just start with them. They support multiple, at a project level, open community project level, they support multiple container standards. So they will support the little d Docker standard or little d Docker implementation. They will support, in some cases, Rocket. In the case of Mesos, there is a sort of Mesos container standard format and runtime and so forth. So there are multiple implementations of a container standard format and container runtime that are supported by these various container orchestrators, right? In some cases, the platform itself or the technology is a little more tightly coupled. So obviously, we see Big D Docker incorporate, more tightly coupling, for example, Docker Swarm with Docker Machine and Docker technology as opposed to others. We see things like, Cloud Foundry and Diego and Garden right now supporting, kind of a loosely coupled variant of the Docker standard. So anyways, the net of it is there is some coupling between the orchestrators and the various standards that are out there. And, this may evolve over time. It may get to a point where they become very agnostic. It may become on a platform by platform basis to where they become, very tightly coupled. And that's something that people may want to consider. Now, so if you step back from that sort of technology aspect, really where this comes into play is, if you are providing a platform, you're operating a platform, you want to make it, hopefully, as simple as possible to allow developers and applications to be onboarded into your platform. And so, what I suspect that we will see is, as an industry, just stepping back, wearing our industry hat, we would like to see as much standardization of that as possible. We've always found that standards, whether they're like things like Ethernet or Wi-Fi or, various implementations that become a kind of quote unquote industry standard, tend to drive greater adoption, broader adoption of anything. When we see lots of different competing standards or non-compatible standards, the industry tends to sort of slow down. We see some fragmentation, and we see various kind of business strategies kind of come into play, which sometimes they're successful. Other times customers are left sort of asking, what should I do? I don't really know what to do. So there is some coupling. People should sort of be aware that there's some coupling of that. But at the same time, we are seeing just kind of massive growth as a whole in these newer platforms, whether they're based on Kubernetes or Mesos or Docker technologies or other technologies, Cloud Foundry technologies, whatever those might be. So good for the industry as a whole, but things that people should very much be paying attention to. Okay. And sort of the follow-up to that again is should customers or partners or people, who should care about all this? Is it a lot of hand-waving and so forth? And, I think the answer to that is, should you care? It's a great question. I think you're going to care as much as you are interested in building things versus consuming technology, right? If you're in a role somewhere in the industry where you have to care about building this, then yeah, I think you should care about what's going on. You should be paying attention to this. You should be trying to, sort out, make your own decisions about, what's in your best interest, what's in, people down market from you, your customers' best interest. If you are somebody who is just simply consuming this and you don't care, you don't have to care, then maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe you're going to buy technology from a certain vendor. You're going to hope that they assemble things, they test it, validate it, document it, support it, kind of as a complete solution, whether that is an end device, end application container standard, whether that's a container orchestrator and platform, from any number of vendors. I think it really depends on where you are kind of in the ecosystem. And I think the other thing to sort of keep in mind is just because a couple of articles got written or some code exists somewhere in GitHub, people, our industry tends to get sort of worked up about a lot of things. And the reality is, if your concern is not just is something happening in the industry, is there some noise in the system, but, has a standard been reached? Has sort of a definitive statement been made somewhere in the industry that everybody follows? The reality of that is no. If you look at OCI, which is at this point sort of the foundation or the place that's defining container standards, they have not gone off and forked Docker at a basic level. They have not created any they have not created any different standards aside from what was created, a year or so ago, year plus ago, sort of in app C and run C. Are they actively working to make sure that, we have a very good, vibrant, standard format, standard runtime, standard capability? Yeah, absolutely they are. And there are lots of different companies that are contributing to that. I think there's over 50 or 60 companies at this point doing that. So again, to answer the question, should you care? Again, it really depends on, how much the nuances of what goes on in communities, how standards are formed, how architecture is done matters to you versus whether you're just simply an end consumer of it or you're a builder. So, I'm going to sort of leave that at that. So let's get into some of the nuances of the follow-on things that have come out of, what's going on in these discussions. So, the OCI, again, the Open Container Initiative, there was a project, again, a GitHub project, and in full disclosure, it was originally created by somebody who works for Red Hat, still works for Red Hat, and it was originally called OCID, and which would stand for Open Container Initiative Daemon. And if you look at the project, it was, like I said, originally called OCID. It's since been renamed to CRI-IO. I'll have to get you the name. All the notes are in the show notes. But, if you look at it, it was in essence a daemon that was created to be a container runtime format, how to standardize how to download containers in container packages, how to upload them to a registry, and some other details. And it was really targeted at saying, should there be one specific for Kubernetes, as opposed to Kubernetes supporting lots of different things, Docker, Rocket, and so on and so forth. Should there be one standard one for Kubernetes? And so I'll step back just from a kind of details perspective. Again, this was a open source project. It was created by an individual. And it's what's sort of important to remember here is a couple of things. Number one, nothing becomes kind of official in OCI until it becomes a promoted project, right? And if you look at their official promoted projects, you have Kubernetes, you have Prometheus, which is a monitoring technology. We talked with some folks from Prometheus here a couple weeks ago on the Cloudcast, but that's it at this point. Everything else is, purely experimental, right? Think of it as, not even alpha or beta for some typical piece of software you'd buy. So it's a project. It exists. It's not an official OCI project. And in fact, the reason the project had to be changed in name from OCID to CRIO is because, the OCI came back and said, hey, you know what? Naming matters. Sort of our brand and our brand awareness matters. We appreciate that you're trying to create a project that will fit in the domain of what could be the OCI at some point. But until that becomes official, like a Kubernetes or a Prometheus, you can't be using the OCI sort of naming and branding. And, sort of fair criticism, fair correction by them, and hence the reason the project has been renamed to CRIO, CRI-O, to make sure that there is no misunderstanding that this is sort of an official OCI project. There's no misunderstanding that it has the blessing of the OCI or it's somehow a standard or something that everybody has to implement. Now, the second part of it is, what is this stuff? Why is this going on? Why would somebody like Red Hat do this? And is this Red Hat doing it on their own? It is again, like the name sort of implied, it's a kind of a daemon runtime specifically to put code in place for sort of a reference implementation that exists around Kubernetes, which says, hey, here's how you would build a specific format and runtime and interaction model for containers to interact with the Kubernetes API. And the thing for people to remember is, every project gets started by somebody. It could have been started by Red Hat. It could have been started by Google. It could have been started by any random individual who felt like, hey, I think there is a need for this. And we will see what happens, as this individual project evolves, just like we do with every open source project, whether or not it gathers a mass of community who are interested in helping to evolve it and support it. We will see if an alternative implementation spins out of this. Somebody else may decide, hey, maybe that's a good idea. I like the concept of it, but I don't like the implementation, and I don't even like where it started as an implementation. And so I want to try an alternative project. And so, we'll see where any individual project goes. The sort of follow-up question is probably, should there be a Kubernetes specific, way of doing this? And that's an open-ended question, I would say. I don't want to give an answer to that because, quite honestly, there is not a, definitive yes or no answer at this point. I think we are seeing, we know factually, we know that there is a lot of interest in Kubernetes. We are seeing a lot of companies deploy Kubernetes into production. I think we're going to see quite a bit of data come out of KubeCon in November. I think it's around November 7th, 8th, and 9th is when the KubeCon event is coming out. We do know for a fact that Kubernetes has a huge amount of community support behind it. I think around 900 developers are actively working on it these days. We are seeing a lot of companies who are openly saying, hey, we deploy Kubernetes. You can look at job boards and so forth. So we do know factually that there is a lot of demand for Kubernetes, and we are seeing quite a few deployments of Kubernetes. Many of them people saying they're being used in production. Take that for with a grain of salt. People have different opinions on do things really run in production, but we are hearing this from the marketplace. Whether or not it's a good thing or not for there to be a Kubernetes specific implementation, runtime, format, and so forth is going to be up to the marketplace. A lot of those deployments of Kubernetes today have been using Docker as the standard, the open standard for how to do that. We'll see if that continues, if the marketplace wants that, if the marketplace wants a different set of endpoint tools or a different standard, we'll see that through contributions and so forth. So, I want to be very clear that there is no right answer to that at this point. It is, a project that has only been kicked around for a few weeks or a few months, and that, people looking to see, does this drive a new standard should be looking at the higher level body that defines those standards, which is the OCI, not any sort of given individual project or any given individual or company that might be, writing that. So I know some people will say, hey, Brian, that's kind of a biased red hat opinion or kind of a spin on it. Again, take it for what it's worth. Look at how open communities work, look at where people are putting their development resources and where companies are doing implementations, and then make your own decision from that. And then, I'll sort of finish up with this as sort of a last project, because we're getting very close to the end of the show. Again, what does all this stuff mean? Forget about all the community back and forth, the media back and forth, the sort of clickbait titles that might be happening in certain articles or whatever. What does this all mean? What should I think about? Well, I think the couple of things to sort of take away from this are, we are definitely at a stage where this is important for businesses. If it wasn't important for businesses, you sort of the typical line, follow the money and you will figure out if something's important. This is important for businesses, both end user businesses, banks, insurance companies, airplane manufacturers, car manufacturers, anybody who runs a business cares about, this evolution of technology having a bigger impact on their business. Whether it's containers or not, we are seeing across the board, people being very interested in, trying to figure out what's the new way I'm going to interact with the marketplace. And if technology is that, I need to be better at that. I need to be smarter at that. I need to deploy it faster. The second piece is we're obviously seeing a massive shift in the industry in terms of how current applications are being run, in terms of cost savings, in terms of efficiency, but more so, how new applications are being built. And so we're seeing a huge paradigm shift because of mobile, because of real-time applications, because of scale out and other things. So we know that for a fact. And the thing to take away from this is, anytime you have massive, massive changes, and this is, in reality, a massive change. This is a shift of paradigm that has been going on for about 20 years or so, very client-server centric, monolithic, if you will, to more microservices, smaller, faster, more agile. And whenever you have massive changes like that on both sides of the industry, you're going to have a certain amount of change. You're going to have certain times when there's rapid change. You're going to have other times when it feels somewhat chaotic because there are alternative choices that are out there. But again, I think the thing to take away from this is, understand what these changes mean to you, especially from a business perspective. How do I begin to think about this culturally? How do I think about this, how it impacts my business? Get smart about what some of these technologies mean. There are a ton of really good tutorials out there. There are some very good blog posts. There are some great people in the community who are willing to, talk to you, reach out to them via Twitter, reach out to them via however, meet them in a community meetup, and get to better understand how the open source process works, because most of these technologies, almost all of them, are being built in open source communities. It's important to understand that this is not just hey, it's a hot new thing, I'll just buy it from somebody. There is a pretty well-defined process of how open communities work, how contributions work, how popularity of these things get evolved. And I think it's important that everybody spend some time, if you're really interested in this, if you really want to know how it works, understand how those communities work. Because if you understand how the communities work, you can begin to make some decisions and some conclusions about where will the future of certain technologies go. So with that, I appreciate everybody's time listening to this. I know it was a different format. Again, I had intended this to be a back and forth with Aaron and I, sort of asking questions and answering questions. That didn't work out, but we wanted to make sure that you guys had a show for this week. For anybody that is in the path of Hurricane Matthew, we hope you are safe, taking care of your family, taking care of yourself, putting your safety as a priority. As always, thank you so much for everybody for listening, for contributing your feedback. We love that the community continues to grow around the Cloudcast, just as it continues to grow around these technologies. And again, any feedback you have about the show, if you felt like the opinions were incorrect, if you felt like they were biased, give us the feedback. We'd love to have the discussion about it. We'd love to get smarter. We'd love to get your opinion on things. So for Aaron and for myself, thank you for listening, and everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.